subcommittees on national security and interior will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. The state of preparedness against the threat of an electromagnetic pulse is the subject of today's hearing. An electromagnetic pulse could be created through an attack from a missile, nuclear weapon, radio frequency weapon, or geomagnetic storm caused by the sun. Fallout from an EMP event, either man-made or natural, could be extremely significant, ranging from the loss of electrical power for months, which would deplete energy sources of power such as emergency batteries and backup generators, have cascading consequences for supplying basic necessities such as food and water, and result in loss of life. The electrical grid is necessary to support critical infrastructure, supply and distribution of food, water, and fuel, communications, transportation, financial transactions, and emergency and government services. Significant damage to the electrical grid during an EMP event would quickly and significantly degrade the supply of these basic necessities. EMPs can also be caused by solar storms, also referred to as geomagnetic disturbances, which are basically an everyday occurrence. They just don't always hit the Earth. Two significant storms that did enter the Earth's atmosphere occurred in 1859 and 1921, respectively. Given the limited use of electricity in the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, the impact on society was relatively minimal. Today, however, society depends heavily on a variety of technologies that are vulnerable to the effects of intense solar storms. Scientists predict that these storms impact the Earth once every 100 to 150 years. So it's not a question of if, but a question of when. The occurrence today of an event like the 1921 storm could result in large-scale and prolonged blackouts affecting more than 100 million people. The National Academy of Sciences estimates the cost of damage from the most extreme solar weather at $1 to $2 trillion, with a recovery time of 4 to 10 years. The costs from even short-term blackouts are significant. In July of 1977, a blackout in New York that lasted only one day resulted in widespread looting and the breakdown of law through many New York neighborhoods. The blackout cost approximately $346 million, and nearly 3,000 people were arrested during a 26-hour period. In August of 2003, more than 200 power plants were shut down as a result of an electricity cutoff caused by cascading failure. The blackout affected Ohio, New York, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and parts of Canada. Although relatively short in duration, the blackout's economic cost was between $7 billion and $10 billion due to food spoilage, lost production, overtime wages, and other related costs. To look at this threat, Congress has created two EMP commissions, which reported their findings in 2004 and in 2008. Based in large part on their recommendations, a bill has been introduced in every Congress since 2009 to strengthen protection of the electrical grid by mitigating the effects of an EMP. Some bills have passed the House, but no bills have yet become law. Congress is not alone in its assessment of the EMP threat. State governments, such as in New York and Massachusetts, have taken action themselves to protect portions of the electrical grid located within their respective states. Even some individual utilities have correctly assessed their vulnerability to EMP and hardened a few of their critical electrical control centers. The Department of Defense recently decided to move the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, back inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado because the mountain is EMP hardened and would allow the military to sustain communications and homeland defense operations despite an EMP event. One of our witnesses here today, Dr. Peter Pry, wrote in the Wall Street Journal earlier this month about the military's decision and rightly surmised, quote, "The Pentagon was wise to move NORAD back into Cheyenne Mountain, but how are the American people to survive?" End quote. The Department of Homeland Security, the federal agency responsible for protecting the American citizens, is not doing enough to lead an interagency effort to mitigate the impact of an EMP event, leaving vast populations of Americans vulnerable to the effects of an EMP. Lastly, the draft executive order by the National Space Weather Strategy released for comment earlier this month by the White House Office of Science and Technology Council. This order is necessary and clearly within the constitutional mandate to provide for the common defense, but it is an outline of goals, not what is needed, a strategy with priorities and a blueprint for how to reliably mitigate adverse solar weather. It is essential that state and national leaders have adequate plans at hand to determine how best to respond to EMP threats as they arise. As such, it is critical that a scenario focused on the EMP threat be included in national planning scenarios by the Department of Homeland Security. This is precisely the directive included in the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, sponsored by my good friend Congressman Trent Franks, who will be here with us today later to discuss the importance of the EMP issue. His bill would require DHS to take the lead for researching how to best prepare and protect American citizens from the threat of an EMP event. And Trent is also the leading sponsor on legislation such as the Secure High Voltage Infrastructure for Electricity from Lethal Damage Act, the SHIELD Act, which again seeks to strengthen America's hand against an EMP attack. I look forward to hearing Trent's thoughts on this issue when he's able to come, as well as our other witnesses, because this is an important issue and there are things our government can do to address it right now. And with that, I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and also Chairwoman Lummis for holding this hearing to examine our state of preparedness against the threat of an electromagnetic pulse event, also known as an EMP. And as well, I'd like to thank our colleague, Mr. Franks of Arizona, who will, as you say, join us shortly, and also our other witnesses on the panel today for helping us with our work. As set forth in President Obama's 2015 National Security Strategy, a comprehensive national security agenda must prioritize efforts to address the top strategic risks to the U.S. interests, including the possibility of a catastrophic attack on U.S. critical infrastructure. Similarly, the strategic plan developed by the Department of Homeland Security provides that we must enhance security for our nation's critical infrastructure against the threat of a terrorist attack by identifying key vulnerabilities and addressing them through the implementation of appropriate technologies. In support of our shared responsibility to protect America against attack, we must make every effort to examine the extent of potential threats, such as an electromagnetic pulse event, to our homeland security. This oversight is even more critical given that the current budgetary climate requires Congress to make very difficult choices in determining federal agency spending. Now, not only is the federal government still operating under sequestration, but unfortunately, Congress recently passed a budget blueprint that contemplates cutting non-defense spending, including our homeland security budget that could be helpful on this issue, by nearly $500 billion below sequestration level spending caps. While government officials, scientists, and other experts may disagree on the imminence of electromagnetic pulse event, the EMP Commission, established by Congress in 2001 to assess the threat of an EMP attack, reported that our national electric grid and other U.S. critical infrastructure could be significantly disrupted by a sudden and high-intensity energy field burst. Now, as the Chairman noted, this could be large in scale and produced by a nuclear explosion. It could also be created through the use of batteries, reactive chemicals, and other non-nuclear devices, or be the product of a natural magnetic storm. According to the Commission's 2008 report, and this is a quote, because of the ubiquitous dependence of U.S. society on electrical power systems, its vulnerability to an EMP attack, coupled with the EMP's particular damage mechanisms, creates the possibility of a long-term catastrophic consequence. A 2012 research paper prepared by a fire department in my congressional district, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit the report by Deputy Chief Michael K. Laracy, Sr. from the wonderful town of Walpole, Massachusetts. He's a deputy fire chief there. The title is Potential Impacts of Electromagnetic Pulse Attacks on Fire and EMS Delivery Services for the Walpole Fire Department.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. In response to such concerns, the House passed H.R. 3410, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, by voice vote at the end of last year. This bill, introduced by our friend Mr. Franks from Arizona, sought to require the Department of Homeland Security to include the EMP threat in its national planning scenarios. While the bill did not pass the Senate, DHS has indicated that the threat of an EMP attack is very much on its radar. During recent congressional testimony, Ms. Suzanne Spalding, the Undersecretary for the National Protection and Programs, indicated that the DHS is currently partnering with private sector entities in the electronic sector to determine how best to address the EMP threat. So I look forward to discussing the issue with our witnesses in order to examine what additional steps we might take in order to better safeguard our national electric grid and other critical infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Dr. William Graham, who is chairman of the 2008 EMP Commission, a letter from Dr. William Radasky, president of Meditech Corporation and leading EMP expert for more than 50 years, and a letter, fact sheet, and cost estimate model from Thomas Popick, chairman of the Foundation for Resilient Societies. Without objection, so order. I now recognize the chairwoman of the Natural Resources Subcommittee, Mrs. Lummis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman DeSantis, for spearheading this hearing. And I also want to thank the ranking member. Ranking Member Lynch, thanks for your participation and involvement in this hearing. To examine the important issue of electrical grid preparedness in the event of an electromagnetic pulse caused by an attack or a solar storm hitting the Earth. The threat to the grid infrastructure is real, and the potential for devastating impacts needs to be examined. Solar flares have resulted in numerous incidents. The Carrington event of 1859, which at the time only affected telegraph systems, to be honest, I don't remember the Carrington event personally. I was a mere child at the time. That was a little joke. But I do remember the 1989 geomagnetic storm that disrupted radio signals and satellite damage and knocked out the power grid in Quebec. The grid is a critical piece of national infrastructure that contributes to the most basic daily needs of Americans, as well as business and government. Given the threat presented to this critical infrastructure, I agree with Chairman DeSantis that the federal government needs to take the EMP threat seriously by including it in DHS national planning scenarios. That's why I support Congressman Ted Frank's Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. This important bill takes a step forward towards protecting our grid against an EMP threat. I note that it passed the House last Congress, and I appreciate all the hard work that Congressman Trent Franks has done on this issue. The federal government needs to follow the lead of state-based utilities and harden the grid against an EMP threat. As we will hear today, the entirety of the nation's grid is not prepared to deal with a variety of threats. It is important that the federal government realize this and take the necessary steps to protect the grid. I welcome the testimony of our witnesses today, and I look forward to hearing more about what our country needs to do to protect against the threats of EMPs. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. We will now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. George Baker, Professor Emeritus at James Madison University and CEO of BACOR, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and Mr. Mike Caruso, Director of Government and Specialty Business Development at ETS Lindgren. Welcome all. Pursuant to committee rules, witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. So if you guys can rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and you'll see the blinking lights in front of you. When it hits red, that's when you've hit 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made a part of the record. And with that, Dr. Baker, you are up for 5 minutes.
My thanks to Chairman DeSantis, Chairman Lummis, ranking members, and committee members for this opportunity to share my concerns about EMP. My name is George Baker. I've spent most of my professional career protecting the U.S. military from EMP. At the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, I manage the development of the military standards used to protect the Department of Defense systems. As a retired professor, James Madison University, and DoD consultant, I now perform EMP vulnerability assessments of key government facilities. The Congressional EMP Commission, on which I served as principal staff, made a compelling case for protecting critical infrastructure against nuclear EMP and solar storm geomagnetic disturbances. I'll also refer to that as GMD. Among potential disasters, EMP and GMD are particularly challenging because the effects can be continental in scale. EMP and GMD disasters are preventable. That's my main point today. They are preventable. We have the engineering know-how and tools. What is missing is resolve. I see three reasons why we are not making progress at present on these threats, and I'll address these in the rest of my talk. The first is there are many misconceptions about EMP and GMD threats. I'll look at 4 of those. The first misconception is that only major nuclear powers, such as Russia and China, with high-yield thermonuclear devices could effectively execute an EMP attack. In fact, low-yield devices obtained by emerging nuclear powers, such as North Korea and Iran, can produce catastrophic EMP effects. Misconception 2, that a nuclear EMP attack would burn out every exposed electronic system. In fact, based on government tests, we know that smaller, self-contained, self-powered systems, such as vehicles, handheld radios, disconnected portable generators, are often not affected. Misconception 3, EMP effects on critical infrastructure will be limited to non-severe nuisance-type effects. In fact, wide area failure of just a few systems could cause cascading infrastructure collapse in highly interconnected networks. And one example is the 2003 electric blackout of the Northeast was precipitated by a single high voltage line touching a tree and then proceeded to cascade to the entire Northeast. So when you extend this concept to a wide area of failures in infrastructure networks, including the internet, you can see that EMP is an existential threat that we must take very seriously. The fourth and final misconception I'll address, that is to protect all of our infrastructure against EMP would cost a large fraction of the U.S. GNP. In fact, protecting the electric grid and communication networks alone would provide substantial benefit and be cost effective. A recent cost study by the Foundation for Resilient Society shows that significant EMP protection could be achieved for an investment in the range of $10 to $30 billion. The second reason we aren't making progress is the stakeholders are in a state of denial. Concern about cost makes stakeholders in government and the private sector reluctant to admit EMP vulnerabilities. Actions to date have been limited and ineffective. An example is the joint effort of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that is FERC, and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, that is NERC, to set reliability standards for wide area electromagnetic impacts on the electric grid. The NERC developed and FERC approved standards that we have exclude nuclear EMP despite the opportunity to protect against both GMD and EMP using the same equipment. NERC standards rely on operational procedures that require no physical protection of the electric grid. The largest measured storms are a factor of 10 higher than the NERC benchmark for protection. A skeptic might suspect that NERC's main objective was to avert liability rather than to protect the American public. Third reason we aren't making progress is there's no one in charge. There's no single point of responsibility to develop and implement a national EMP protection plan. When I asked NERC officials about EMP protection, they informed me, we don't do EMP, that's DoD's responsibility. The Department of Defense tells me EMP protection for civilian infrastructure is DHS's responsibility. And then when I talk to DHS, I get answers that the protection should be done by the Department of Energy, since they're the infrastructure sector-specific agency. So we have EMP and GMD protection as finger-pointing exercises at present. In closing, I have the following recommendation for future progress. The DoD experience with EMP protection has given us the necessary engineering tools, but what we need is the help of your committee to get government to act. First, we need a designated executive authority. The DHS and DOD both are likely candidates. The first order of business would be a national EMP GMD protection plan and a set of planning scenarios. Second, let us budget for a national program to protect the electric grid, including essential supporting infrastructures used for fuel supply and communication. And third, Congress should recognize that the regulatory apparatus conceived in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 is not working. Establishing a new independent commission solely focused on electric grid reliability would be very helpful. A commission with the power to issue and enforce regulations on its own, similar to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The present FERC-NERC arrangement has proved ineffective. Thank you for this opportunity to present my concerns and recommendations, which are more fully explained in my written testimony, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. The chair now recognizes Dr. Pry for 5 minutes. You're up.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittees today. First, what I think we must understand about the threat is that it is not merely theoretical. It is a real threat. In the military doctrines of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, they plan to make a nuclear EMP attack against the United States. We have seen North Korea and Iran exercise this, including by launching ballistic missiles off of a freighter at sea, which would enable the possibility of an anonymous EMP attack. During the nuclear crisis we had with North Korea in 2013, it was the worst nuclear crisis we ever had when Kim Jong-un was threatening to make nuclear missile strikes against the United States in the aftermath of their third illegal nuclear test. In the midst of that crisis, North Korea orbited a satellite over the South Pole that passed over the territory of the United States on the optimum trajectory and altitude to both evade our national missile defenses and, had that been a nuclear warhead, to place an EMP field over all 48 contiguous United States that would have had catastrophic consequences. That was the KSM-3 satellite. That satellite still passes over us. It's still in orbit and passes over us with regularity. Another thing that must be understood is EMP is part of a larger part of their military doctrine, what they consider a revolution in military affairs, that basically is a combined arms operation with cyber attacks, physical sabotage, non-nuclear EMP weapons, and nuclear EMP weapons as the most decisive instrument, all used together and coordinated in a form of a new blitzkrieg, except one that's waged in cyberspace, to basically bring a civilization down to its knees so that a failed state like an Iran or North Korea could theoretically defeat and destroy a highly advanced society like our own. But this would be unprecedented in history, where you would have a situation where a state like an Iran or North Korea, or even a subnational actor like a terrorist group, if they could get hold of that one nuclear bomb and do it in combination with cyber attacks and physical sabotage to crash our critical infrastructures, especially the electric grid, and basically destroy our civilization. But they write about it, they exercise it. They're serious about it. And we actually see this being practiced in real life in some countries. Back in June of last year, while ISIS was sweeping over northern Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula blacked out the entire electric grid in the state of Yemen, put 18 cities and 24 million people into the dark. That's the first time in history that a terrorist group has blacked out a whole country. And it so destabilized Yemen that look what happened to them. You know, they've gone from being a U.S. ally, so now we have lost one of our most important allies in the Middle East already to this kind of an attack. This year, in January 25th of this year, a terrorist group blacked out 80% of the grid in Turkey. We don't know what they're up to in doing that, in Pakistan. But Pakistan is a nuclear weapons state. So the idea that 80% of the grid could be blacked out in Pakistan for purposes unknown is extremely disturbing. Is this a precursor to try to get their hands on nuclear weapons in Pakistan? About a week before the Washington blackout happened, Turkey 80% of Turkey was put into blackout by a cyber attack by Iran. Now, these were not EMP attacks, but they're the experiments with parts of this doctrine that they have that would combine all these things. And we have seen, in the case of North Korea and Iran, experiments with the nuclear EMP option as well. Now, so the threat is real. As George Baker has testified, however, there's really no excuse for us to be vulnerable to this. We know how to fix the problem. And one of the things the EMP Commission recommended is if you can protect against the worst threat, which is the nuclear EMP attack, if you can protect against that, it will mitigate all the others. cyber attacks, physical sabotage, non-nuclear EMP weapons, and GMD as well. So we know how to fix the problem. What to do? I endorse everything that Dr. Baker said. We need to pass the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. The importance of having a national planning scenario focused on EMP cannot be understated. Right now, despite what DHS may be telling you, if it is not in the national planning scenarios, the threat doesn't exist for state and local emergency planners or for federal emergency planners too. People who want to do something about this threat at the state level, when they apply for funding, for example, from DHS, can't get it because EMP is not among the national planning scenarios. So that would put it on the radar screen for federal, state, and local emergency planners, and would be an enormous step forward towards solving the problem. Next, we need to bring back the Congressional EMP Commission, which is actually it's under consideration right now in the Defense Authorization Bill being negotiated with the Senate. The greatest progress we made in this country was when the EMP Commission was around. And, with the absence of the commission, well, we have seen that no progress has been made. If we can bring back the EMP Commission, I expect that that would reintroduce, we would have a voice in the governmental level, a part of Congress, that could aggressively promote EMP preparedness, and that is what we need to do. And last, the NERC-FERC relationship, I completely agree with Dr. Baker, is extremely dysfunctional. It doesn't work. It needs to be reformed. I'm not sure that you can actually reform those institutions. I would actually advocate abolishing both FERC and NERC and starting with something else, a different kind of an institution, something similar to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that has real regulatory power and that understands that its stakeholder, its customer, is not the electric power industry first, but it's the American people first. And the responsibility is not first to the profits of the utilities, but it's to America's national security. Thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you. Mr. Caruso, thank you for coming. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank Chairman DeSantis, Chairman Lummis, ranking members, and committee members for this opportunity to testify. I consider it an honor and a privilege to be here today to share my 32 years of experience in the practical side of protecting against EMP events. EMP hardening has long been considered very expensive and an elusive art known to few. The current guidance on EMP protection is found in the MIL Standard 188-125 that is not necessarily appropriate for every application when considering the critical infrastructure. EMP hardening of the critical infrastructure would require a less stringent application of the MIL Standard 188-125. Government, public, and private critical infrastructure facilities and services are becoming increasingly interdependent, as we've seen with many of the companies that I've talked to over the past 3 years. In addition to the interdependency of those services, we see an increasingly dependency upon the very vulnerable electric grid and electric power system. To date, little has been done to harden the electric power system and the 16 segments of critical infrastructure as designated by Department of Homeland Security. Currently, 18 states have ongoing initiatives to require the electric utilities to at least address the protection of the electrical grid from the dangers of an EMP or solar storm. Electromagnetic energy from an EMP can disrupt the supervisory and control data acquisition systems, or SCADA systems, which the electric grid heavily relies. I've recently testified at the Texas State House in support of bills introduced for EMP protection of the critical infrastructure. Texas is one of the states aggressively pursuing passage of EMP legislation, including an appropriation to get critical infrastructure segments started in the overall evaluation of their vulnerability. In 2014, ETS Lindgren, the company for which I work, was part of a multidisciplinary team that successfully completed construction of the very first large private sector SCADA facility in the United States that includes EMP protection. The building was a 2-story, 105-square-foot building, of which 44,000 square feet were EMP protected. That included generators and cooling systems. The total project cost was about $100 million, and the approximate EMP protection part of that was about $8 million. So if we're looking at it, about 8% of the overall budget. If we looked at that cost spread over the 2 million customers that that building serves, we're looking at less than $1 per year per customer spread out over 5 years. While the optimum scenario is to protect a brand-new control building, retrofitting is possible. And I've spoken with quite a few electric utilities about retrofitting their control buildings. If we're looking at the existing facilities are tremendously vulnerable because the equipment was never intended to be EMP protected, nor were the support systems ever laid out properly to be protected. An estimated rough order of magnitude for protecting a similar facility as the 44,000 square feet that we talked about in the new building would be approximately $16 million. And there again, when you take a look at that and spread that out over 5 years, it's less than $2 per customer based on a 2 million customer service area. In my opinion, EMP protection of the electric utilities is the primary concern due to the survival and dependency we have on electrical power. Some proactive, forward-thinking utilities have either instituted EMP protection programs or have at least begun to consider implementing them. However, the balance of the critical infrastructure segments, such as financial, wastewater, drinking water, transportation, food distribution, healthcare, emergency services, have really not ever been addressed at all. It is my sincere belief we as a nation will someday face an EMP attack. I respectfully urge you to consider and pass legislation to address the EMP threat that I believe has been overlooked for far too long. Chairman DeSantis, Chairman Lewis, ranking members, committee members, I thank you again for this opportunity to present my thoughts, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions you have of me. Thank you for your time.
I thank the witnesses for your testimony. The chair now recognizes himself for question for 5 minutes. Dr. Baker, you talked in your written testimony about the critical importance of the electric grid. So an EMP attack that would fry the electric grid, can you just explain the consequences to somebody who maybe has never heard of an EMP before today's hearing? What practical effect would that have on American society?
The electric grid is the foundation for all other infrastructures. You know, DHS has listed 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and the one sector that that drives everything else is the electric power. The other thing about the electric power, it not only is the most critical, arguably the most critical infrastructure, it's arguably the most vulnerable to EMP because you measure EMP in volts per meter. So the longer the line, the larger the voltage it will be induced on the line. So it's ironic that our most critical infrastructure is also the most vulnerable, and that's why we have to be so serious about protecting the grid. But without the electric grid, basic life services, the ability to pump drinking water, the ability to heat or cool our homes.
Take out money from an ATM, would you be able to do that?
Yeah, that's right. You would our financial sector is also way up there on the in terms of EMP vulnerability and the risk factor, mainly because it depends upon the electric grid and the long haul communications as well. So essentially it would be we've seen sort of a microcosm of what could happen in the Northeast blackout and the anarchy that resulted there. But that in Britain, I've been to some EMP meetings in Britain where they actually are protecting their grid. But their rule of thumb is it's 3 days to total anarchy, as I heard this member of parliament say, once you lose the electricity. Yeah.
And in terms of some of the casualties, because people have surmised, man, terrorists, if they could get their hands on a nuclear device detonated in American City, it'd obviously be very devastating. And some have said, yeah, that would be, but their best bet to do the most damage would be to try to launch it over the country and explode it and create an EMP. And the casualty estimates I've seen are really, really high if they were able to cripple our entire electrical grid. Is that your understanding, that you're talking about potentially millions of people who could die?
Even though you don't get direct effects on biological, humans, the long-term effects without the electric power grid. We're talking about certainly within a year, we'd lose at least half the American population. I've seen estimates as high as 90% of the American population would be at risk over a protracted, 1-year period.
So given that the consequences are potentially very dire, but also given that, I think as all the witnesses have said, there are certainly things we could do very easily, why haven't we done enough, in your opinion?
One of the problems is that the liabilities, public companies are reluctant to admit vulnerabilities because if something bad were to happen, they would be liable, and I think that's a big problem. And just the the cost, the wide area effects, we get into these hand-wringing stances where people, they don't know where to begin, so they haven't. And what we're trying to do is lay out, a well-ordered, incremental approach where to get us beyond the hand-wringing.
Mr. Caruso, you've been involved in this field and have done work hardening critical infrastructure against an EMP attack. So help us understand what is involved when you actually try to harden a facility or a line.
Certainly. In addition to the critical infrastructure, I've been involved in hardening military and government facilities for the 32 years in this business. And essentially what's required to harden a facility is to create an electromagnetic shield, a 6-sided electromagnetic shield around the equipment that's intended to be protected.
And as of right now, in your judgment and based on your experience, what percentage of the electrical grid is prepared for an EMP threat?
Currently, there's only one control center in the entire country that I'm aware of that is protected.
And which one's that?
I'm not allowed to say because of non-disclosure agreements that I'm under.
Understood. My time has expired. Thanks for answering the questions, and I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the subcommittee on national security, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what we're saying here is that because of the interconnectivity of our society today, the great reliance and connectivity to the Internet, so much of every aspect of our lives is wired now, that fact will actually amplify the impact of an EMP event. Is that basically what you're saying, Mr. Baker? Dr. Baker?
That's right.
Right. Now, for countermeasures, I understand, and I don't question the level of disruption that would occur, and I guess the imminence of this is debatable, but there's no debate about the disruption that would result if one of these EMPs occurred. The countermeasures that have been talked about, the folks at CRS that serve Congress, the Congressional Research Service, mentioned a couple of countermeasures. One was this Faraday cage protection, which I guess is some type of a cladding. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Right, and Mike Caruso just mentioned this idea of a 6-sided shield.
Okay.
You have a 6-sided metal enclosure that's referred to in electrical engineering as a Faraday cage.
Okay. Mr. Caruso, you want to go into that a little bit more?
Certainly. The 6-sided metal shield has to be constructed so it basically has no openings in it except those that are absolutely necessary to have. And all of those openings are technically considered to be points of entry. So you start out by building a 6-sided metal box with no openings, and then you start adding openings for things like the electrical power, communications, and air exchanges and cooling systems. And all of those points of entries are handled in a very, very special and particular way in order to ensure that you are attenuating any EMP signal that might be broadcast in the atmosphere, but also any signals that are being brought in, conducted on the electrical lines or communication lines.
Sort of like a surge protector, that type of?
Exactly, a surge protector on steroids, if you would.
Yeah. Now what about the other countermeasure that I'm not sure if it incorporates the Faraday cage protection, these portable or mobile units that I guess some of the contractors for Microsoft and I guess some of the other computer outfits have come up with sort of an off-the-rack type of system where they can house all of these servers in the event that you have an event. Is that one and the same, or are those two different strategies?
It's one and the same in terms of technology. The portable data centers, if you will, the EMP protected data centers, are essentially six-sided Faraday cages with all the points of entry addressed, and sometimes they get actually interfaced with the fixed asset that might be inside of a building. So they become a supplement to what's going on in the building. These same shelters sometimes hold backup generator systems or backup cooling systems to act as protection against the EMP for those systems as well.
Okay. So the last time we had a talk about this was, well, the study was done in 2008, I think, and then there were 16 recommendations. Is there anything different that we're doing now than what was going on at that point, talking about Congress?
The only substantive response to the EMP recommendations has been within the Department of Defense, where they are actually providing an annual report to Congress on the steps that they're taking to meet the EMP Commission recommendations. And but as far as the civilian infrastructure, I'm not aware of any progress.
Dr. Pry, I don't want you to get off the hook without a question. The general recommendation then would be to adopt some of these countermeasures for infrastructure that we identify as being critical, whether it's civilian critical infrastructure or military infrastructure. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. You know, for example, there are 2,000 extra high voltage transformers that are basically the technological foundation of our electronic civilization. You know, most people don't even know that. And these things are vulnerable to EMP. They should be protected. You know, they're very hard. We don't even make them in this country anymore. But that's an example. The Commission had a rather long list of recommendations, basically a plan, that could be implemented to protect the civilian critical infrastructures at affordable cost. It's not hard to do. The technology isn't the problem. The money isn't the problem. It doesn't cost that much to do it. It's the politics that has been the problem. As George has said, nobody has responsibility for doing this. Those you would think have responsibility, the Department of Defense, for example, when you talk about, they have no jurisdiction over the civilian critical infrastructure. And they'll say, well, this could be caused by a geomagnetic storm, and that's not our department. We're dealing with foreign threats, so it's the Department of Homeland Security's job. DHS will say, well, a nuclear weapon, that's the DOD's job. So nobody has been in charge. And then where it counts the most is we have this very dysfunctional relationship between the NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, that represents the 3,000 utilities, that's supposed to be a partner with U.S. FERC in providing for grid security. But the political reality is that that relationship is dysfunctional, and it has not resulted in not only in increasing our security where EMP is concerned, but even against tree branch problems, for instance. It took NERC a decade to come up with a vegetation management plan to better manage tree branches so that we won't have a repeat of the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003. And they're falling down on the job on very pedestrian threats, let alone cyber threats and EMP attacks and the like. It's just the system isn't working, and that needs to be fixed by somebody.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, the chairman of the Natural Resources Subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a bit of a novice to this subject, so I'm going to ask you some general questions. Feel free to take them wherever you choose. You know, over the weekend, I got a little taste of this. I woke up Sunday morning at my country home in Wyoming without electricity. Had no water because in a rural area, I'm on an electric pump to pump my well water. So the inconveniences associated with being without electricity were apparent from the minute my eyes opened. As it turned out, it was just something, I think they called it a bayonet, which is a very large fuse that they just came and replaced. And believe it or not, they came on Sunday morning, and I was back up and running, and happily so. But when you think about that on the scale that we're talking about it, it really does create immediate global problems, especially in this country. So my first question, Mr. Caruso, what do these things cost, these shields that protect our infrastructure?
The shield that I gave an example of in my testimony was approximately $182 per square foot to put into place. So if you look at a floor plan of a building and look at the square footage, again, about $182 a square foot on top of the building cost itself.
So it's not chump change.
It's not chump change, but it's not insurmountable either.
Yeah. My next question is for all of you. I'm going to direct it to Dr. Pry first, but then I'd like to ask our other two witnesses to weigh in. This is about your concern that the relationship between NERC and FERC is dysfunctional. You mentioned the possibility of doing away with both. So if you were, you know, dictator for a day, and you could do exactly that, either combine NERC and FERC or do away with them and replace them with something else that would solve the dysfunction you've identified, as well as address this electromagnetic pulse issue responsibly, what would that look like?
That would look like the kind of relationship that the Federal Aviation Administration has with the airline industry. What I think that isn't understood is that the electric power industry is the only critical infrastructure that still operates basically in something that's close to a 19th century regulatory environment. The Federal Aviation Administration has the power and has independent inspectors. If they find metal fatigue in the wings of an airline, they can ground that whole fleet and order the airline industry. You're not going to fly those planes until they're fixed. When there's a disaster and an airplane crashes, the industry doesn't get to investigate and figure out what went wrong, not by themselves. It's the Federal Aviation Administration that drags those things into a hangar. And why do we do that? Because we want an objective actor whose first priority is public safety, because hundreds of lives are at stake when airplanes fly. And so we don't, we don't take lightly, the lives of the American people when it comes to that. And if we will go to the Food and Drug Administration or any other industry, I would like that same kind of regulatory relationship with the electric power industry. Let me describe to you a little bit about what the current regulatory environment is like, because it's not really what we would consider a regulatory environment. The U.S. FERC, for example, does not have the power to tell NERC, that is the industry, what they shall do to protect the grid. It can order them to come up with a plan, and then NERC can take as much time as it likes, to come up with a plan or a proposed plan. And then if the U.S. FERC has objections to that plan, the whole plan has to be scrapped and the process starts all over again. That's how it took 10 years to get a plan for vegetation management, so we wouldn't have a repeat of the great Northeast blackout of 2003. Industry takes its time, dragging its feet, and can use this process, to basically escape doing what it's supposed to do. The NERC is supposed to partner with the U.S. FERC in providing for the security of the American people, but it doesn't. And I don't think combining these or keeping the same, I mean, there are some good people in these institutions, but George and I have served, for example, on the NERC's Geomagnetic Disturbance Task Force, and we've actually seen them engage in junk science, dishonest practices, in terms of the science, to try to mislead people. In my written testimony, I describe a very disturbing example of where the NERC came up with a hollow standard for the natural EMP created by the sun, saying, okay, they were dragged kicking and screaming, by the way, and resisted for years, saying that, oh, the threat from the sun doesn't really affect the electric grid, which was completely untrue. Eventually, they were forced to come up with a standard. The standard is so low that it doesn't provide any real protection. And the
Dr.
thing that
Pry, my time has expired, but I'm hoping to follow up with all three of you on this issue in a second round of questioning. Thank you all very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the statement of Ms. Lawrence, who's the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Interior. Without objection, I will be so ordered. And at this point, I would like to recognize Ms. Lawrence for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This issue is one of great importance to me and to our country. The Congressional EMP Commission issued a report in 2008 identifying 16 segments of our infrastructure that could suffer severe damage if not protected. Today, 7 years later, the testimony continues to echo those concerns. I'm curious today, Mr. Caruso, has anything changed since this last report regarding the protection of the grid?
I don't believe anything significant has changed. What we have seen is that many private industries that make up the critical infrastructure have taken it upon themselves, just as doing good business, to do EMP protection. I've worked with several financial institutions, including insurance companies. I've worked with electric utilities and industry as well. But other than that, nothing real significant has happened.
To follow up on your statement, there has been some independent efforts being made in this direction. Are we monitoring that as a federal government? If we start implementing taking the steps that we should, would we have a different system that's being used now, or are we just going to provide oversight to these individual companies? What is the plan that you're recommending here?
Yeah, my recommendation really falls in line with those of Dr. Pry and Dr. Baker, in that someone needs to be in charge, and especially as it's related to the 16 critical infrastructure segments, in terms of providing real protection and at least addressing the issue to ask the question, what if? What happens if we lose the electrical power? What happens if we lose the ability to do it? I like to use the example of the waste treatment systems. If you would not only lose the electrical power, but the control systems that control the wastewater filtration and pumping stations throughout an area. If that goes down in a major city, you have 2 or 3 days before the city is just on its knees.
My question to Dr. Baker, as we look at the need, we heard your recommendations. 2008 was the last report. Will we have to initiate a new commission and a new report so it'd be relevant, or do you feel strongly that the information we have now is enough to move forward with starting our plan?
I believe that the EMP Commission reports that were issued in 2004 and 2008 are still operative. So I would say, yeah, they are a very good place to start. I don't know whether there's anything I can add to those reports. the thing that helps us is that I understand that there's going to be a lot of new construction on the electric grid, and that if we are able to project and develop some plans that we can actually include the EMP protection with the new build out. So there might be some maybe augmentation of the EMP Commission recommendations.
I do want to say, as my time run out, that as a mayor, I lived through the power outages that affected the Midwest. And when you talk about the threat of lives, hospitals that were in my city, individuals stranded on elevators, life support systems and oxygen, getting the pumps backed up with batteries so that we could continue to ensure that our water was properly processed through cleaning water filtration. This is a very serious issue, and I appreciate your testimonies today. And I know for a fact if we receive such an attack, the threat is one that would be significantly dangerous for our country, and a lot of dangerous people don't. Simple, mere traffic navigation, everything came to a complete halt. To be able to sit in a room in our emergency command center with no power, we could not pull up documents of employee records because it was on a computer. So it taught me a lot of how we're dependent just from being a mayor and trying to manage through that power outage. So I thank you today for your testimony.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you. Dr. Pryde, what federal agency do you believe is best suited to lead a preparedness effort for this? Is it Homeland Security? Is it energy? Is it which one is?
I think the Department of Homeland Security, that it naturally falls under their jurisdiction, because they're supposed to be responsible for critical infrastructure protection in the first place. So I think that they're the ones. However, DHS and the Department of Defense are also supposed to have a cooperative relationship, when it comes to providing for Homeland Security. There's a lot of expertise. Now, DHS should have the lead, but there's a lot of expertise in the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense is also dependent on the civilian critical infrastructure.
All right, but at the end of the day, DHS, you believe?
I would say DHS.
All right, does DHS currently have anything to deal with the scenario? They've got the 15 national planning contingency scenarios. Is anything dealing with EMPs a part of those 15 plans?
No, they're not. That's part of the problem, and why we need to pass the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. And I would add that there are people within DHS that are standing by, waiting for us to do exactly that.
All right, so there needs to be, so if DHS is responsible, DHS then needs some sort of plan. Is there a reason there's not a plan if DHS is responsible?
I don't know what the motive has been within the leadership of DHS, because it's been a bipartisan failure,
But a failure it is. We don't need to elaborate. If DHS is responsible, that's one thing. If DHS is responsible and not prepared, that's another issue that certainly needs to be addressed.
I'd say they are responsible and not prepared.
Okay, well then we've got to, that definitely needs to be addressed. Let me go, Mr. Caruso, to you. The hardening a facility, can you elaborate a little bit more on just what that means and what it involves?
Certainly. As was mentioned before, we're talking, the scientific term is Faraday cage, and it essentially, we use steel to do that. So it encloses the area that's intended to be protected in a 6-sided steel enclosure, and all of the points of entry coming in, and most importantly, the electrical power, are fitted with filter devices and suppression devices that would suppress an EMP coming down the line being conducted in from the external power lines. In addition to that, the facility shield protects all of the equipment inside from the radiated effects of an EMP coming down out of the atmosphere. And it needs to also protect the backup generators, the cooling systems, and all of the other support systems that would support a facility.
Okay, I've just got a couple of minutes, so that just a general understanding. I appreciate what you've just shared. Let me, do state governments, and I'll just keep this with you, Mr. Caruso, do state governments have anything right now to protect against EMPs?
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing. All right, so we are totally vulnerable, or that includes all 50 states. There is nothing out there.
Nothing that I'm aware of.
All right. All right, so we have got to address this problem because it is totally not addressed anywhere.
That's correct, except for a handful of private industry actors that have taken it upon themselves to protect it. The control center that I was speaking of before is an electric utility. They took it upon themselves to invest their own money to protect their control center.
Okay, then real quickly across the board, and I'd appreciate an answer real quickly from all three of you. This being the case, what steps do federal entities need to take to protect this? And Mr. Baker, Dr. Baker, I'll start with you just real quickly because I know my time is about up.
First, we need a single authority that's in charge with the power to develop and enforce requirements.
Okay.
And then I think, of the 16 critical infrastructures, if we focused only on the electric power grid, that would be well worth it. We should have a program
All right,
to
real
protect the
quickly,
grid.
Dr. Pry and Mr. Caruso.
Pass the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, which will require the Department of Homeland Security to add a new national planning scenario focused on the EMP threat. All state, local, and federal emergency planning, training, and resource allocation is based on those scenarios. That's why it's not on the radar screen right now. Bring back the Congressional EMP Commission so you can have an aggressive watchdog to make sure that this work gets done and reform the dysfunctional relationship between NERC and FERC. I say abolish them and start all over again. Give the job to DHS, somebody that's willing to do the job.
Unfortunately, my time has expired because Mr. Caruso.
If he can submit your response for the record written would be,
Thank you, Mr.
great.
Chairman.
And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing to inform the public and policymakers about the threat of an EMP device. I have just some preliminary questions. Let's say an EMP device was exploded over the U.S. What is the geographic area that it would affect? The size of D.C., of Maryland, of Virginia, smaller, larger?
An entry-level, low-yield weapon, if it's detonated at the optimum altitude, the diameter of the effect would be 1,200 miles. So it would be a circle with a 1,200-mile diameter.
And then within that circle, so let's say Fry's electrical generators, does it also destroy the lines themselves, or are they still fine? The lines that connect the houses and businesses to the electric grid.
The lines will remain intact. There was some Russian experience where some of their lines, they actually had damage to the support insulators, where some of their lines fell to the ground. But the evidence is that in most cases, the lines would remain intact. It's just what's on the end of the line would be affected.
And then based on the way our electrical power grid is constructed in the U.S., could you take power from another part of the country and route it through the affected area?
That would depend upon the size of the circular diameter. It would be difficult to do that because you're looking at areas that are crossing, the state boundaries and the boundaries of the different power companies. It could be difficult. And the grid control centers, that we don't have grid control centers in most cases that span that large of an area.
Okay. And then I think, Mr. Caruso, you mentioned a cost to harden critical infrastructure. I think you said $182 per what?
Per square foot of floor space, and that's for doing a facility, not looking at the transformer.
So it's hard for me to understand what that means. Can you sort of give me a number if to harden the United States through a place you think is sufficient? Are we talking about 50 million, 50 billion, 500 billion? What is the range here so I can understand that?
I'm sorry, I really don't have that number available in my head. I can submit something.
Or anyone in the panel?
It depends on how much protection you want to buy and what your judgment is, okay? It's sort of like asking, well, how much will it cost to buy fire protection for my house? You know, some plans can be very inexpensive. It can be as simple as buying a smoke alarm, okay, you know, which will cost you very little. Others might want to put a fire extinguisher in every room and put a sprinkler system in, which is going to cost a lot. Here are some legitimate plans and legitimate prices for you to keep in mind, okay, that can range. John Kappenman, who was on our commission, had an idea or a plan that would cost $200 million. And the idea here would be to protect the 200 most important extra high voltage transformers, the ones that service the major metropolitan areas. So John wouldn't say that this is adequate, but it will at least give you a fighting chance to save millions of people from starving to death, you know, because the transformers at least would be saved. The EMP Commission had a plan. It's, you know, right in the plan, it's about $2 billion, okay, that protects all of the transformers and generators and is much more ambitious. And that's a, you know, that's a much better plan and would give you much greater resiliency and confidence in being able to recover the society quickly from an EMP. George Baker described an even better, more ambitious, and I would say a better plan that goes beyond that. It sort of depends on how much do you want to put into prevention. You know, just like in protecting your house. You know, you can spend more money to protect your house and be safer, or you can decide to spend less money and be less safe. But there are a wide variety of plans which industry sometimes misrepresents as being contradictory. They're not. You know, it could range from 200 million up to 20, 30 billion dollars.
And so given those options, as you know, a lot of electrical utilities are regulated by states or cities. What is your view of the federal government's role? Why is it we don't leave it up, for example, to the Public Utilities Commission of California to decide if they want to increase ratepayers, you know, fees on ratepayers in order to harden the facilities there? In other words, or is it your view we should give DHS authority to simply start imposing additional costs on ratepayers so we can harden all these facilities?
Yeah, may I respond?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, you know, because this is, ultimately, this is a national security, especially if you're talking about a nuclear EMP attack or a great geomagnetic storm that could cover not just the United States, but if it's a Carrington event, you're talking about the entire world being affected by this kind of a phenomenon. A threat of this scale should be a federal national security responsibility. The states don't normally think of themselves as protecting themselves against nuclear terrorist attacks. But because of the vacuum...
But they do think about, right, natural disasters. I mean, a massive naturally caused EMP thing would be a natural disaster. So in California, it's not so much a federal government saying, hey, harden yourself against earthquakes. Well, it's actually California building codes that do that. So I'm just sort of curious of, do you think we should have this massive overreaching federal plan, or should we leave it to states and cities and local control?
I personally don't think it should be left to states and cities. But however, you're getting your wish. Because of the vacuum that's been created by the lack of federal leadership on this issue, the states are taking the initiative because they have to. Next week, I'm going up to Maine because Maine has passed a bill to protect its electric grid because the feds haven't done anything. Virginia has passed a bill. Arizona has passed a bill to protect its people. Florida has established a cyber and EMP legislative working group because there's no leadership, no help coming from Washington. And so the states are being made aware. They don't even know about this threat, most of them. But as they become aware of this threat and they realize that the federal government isn't doing anything, they are stepping up to the plate to protect their people. I don't think that that's – I was originally trained as a historian, and I find that rather disturbing, the fact that the states have to do this. You know, one of the signs of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was the rise of walled cities. because Rome could no longer defend its cities against the barbarians. So the states had to start providing for their own, the cities had to start providing for their own security. I don't think that's the way our system is supposed to work. When it comes to national security, the feds aren't supposed to just say, well, the states, go ahead and do the best you can to take care of yourselves. We've got other things to do here. The fundamental constitutional obligation, the reason we have a federal government, is to provide for the common defense.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee for 5 minutes for his question.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this very important hearing. This is just one of thousands of things that we deal with, so none of us are the experts that you all are, but I can tell you this, it's something I've been concerned about for a long time. In fact, just a few days after the 2003 blackout, I gave a speech on the floor, and I quoted from the Associated Press story at the time, and it said the proposed improvements that they were talking about to keep this from happening a second time, it says, quote, are making the electricity supply vulnerable to a different kind of peril, computer viruses and hackers who could black out substations, cities, or entire states. And the story went on to say, it said, quote, in the past, the grid's old electromechanical switches and analog technology make it more or less impervious to computer maladies, but now switches and monitoring gear can be upgraded and programmed remotely with software, and that requires a vulnerable connection to a computer network. If that network runs on Microsoft Corporation operating systems, which virus writers favor, or connects to the internet, the vulnerabilities are increased. That's what came out in 2003. And I'm sorry that I've had to run in and out of here and not hear everything you've said because I've had meetings with constituents, but when I hear you talking about knocking out the power to 80% of Turkey, somebody mentioned that, and all of Yemen, in some ways it seems like we're almost more vulnerable today than we were then. Are we?
Quick answer is yes.
Well, does it, my wife has told me for years I still live in Andy of Mayberry days, and then a few years later I saw that I had the same birthday as Don Knotts, and when I saw that I thought, well, she's been right all these years. So I'm about as low-tech as they come, but it seems ridiculous to me that we're so interconnected with each other that when a crew cuts a tree limb in Cleveland, Ohio, and it cuts off the power to the entire northeastern part of Canada for several hours, it seems like to me that that's just ridiculous that we would allow that to happen.
That's right.
And it also seems to me that we need to get more people interested in this because surely we have people that can figure out, is it possible that, that bigger may not always be better, that maybe we shouldn't have these power companies that are so big that if we broke up some of these power companies and that we wouldn't be so interconnected where what happened to one would affect people all over the country?
Well, actually, that was one of the recommendations of the EMP Commission. It's called islanding. And in effect, it's kind of what's happening at the level of the states. Even though it isn't happening by a plan coming out of Washington, by this natural process of the states deciding to protect themselves, you're creating islands, where if the big grid goes down, at least that state will have its lights stay on. And so,
well,
yes.
that is encouraging. I've been glad to hear that some of these states are taking individual initiatives. I hope that keeps growing.
It makes it harder to do when the NERC claims that they've adopted a GMD standard, and don't worry about it, they're on top of the problem, which they also say about cyber and things like that, which is not true, because it ends up taking away the incentive for the states to protect themselves when NERC convinces them that they are. And I'd like to also make one last statement, because you talked about, are we getting more vulnerable? Another thing that needs to be kept in mind is that we are getting more vulnerable all the time because of the advance of technology. You know, as our semiconductor technology gets better and better and faster and runs on lower and lower voltages, it becomes more and more vulnerable to the EMP effect, which is why we're so vulnerable now. Back in 1962 Starfish Prime test, when that happened, the vacuum tube technology of the day was, was 1 million times less vulnerable to EMP. Still the lights went out in Hawaii, 1 million times less vulnerable. And every time, I think it's every 10 years, we have like a 10-fold increase in the capabilities of our semiconductor technology. It also becomes 10-fold more vulnerable to EMP. So this problem is getting worse and worse. It's not just standing still while we do nothing.
Well, what do you think about this bill by Congressman Franks? Is that a good first step?
The Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, absolutely. It would go in a huge way toward helping solve the problem.
I remember several years ago, I read on the front page of the Washington Post one day that a 12-year-old boy opened up the floodgates at the Hoover Dam 700 miles from his home because he was able to hack in. And it seems to me that, we've got a lot of brilliant people out here that should be able to, that should be working on this. We over-sensationalize a lot of these threats because of a 24-hour news cycle and because so many people and companies make money off of threats that are exaggerated. But in my opinion, this is one that's not being exaggerated and that we need to do a little bit more, and I appreciate what you all are trying to do. I've run out of time. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony, for answering our questions. We wanted to have Congressman Franks testify and present both his critical infrastructure bill and the SHIELD Act, but he has a bill on the House floor right now, and he's not able to attend. So we're sorry that that couldn't be arranged. But clearly, I think from what the witnesses have said, those are the types of pieces of legislation, that I think we need to be moving ahead in Congress. And so if this hearing has helped raise more awareness, and hopefully we can get some bipartisan support for this stuff and move forward. I will hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. And with that, this hearing is now adjourned.